What do you do when you are completely surrounded, outnumbered 5-1, cut off in enemy territory, with freezing temperatures that can jam your weapons and kill you in your sleep? Most armies retreat. Some armies collapse. Many surrender. But in February 1951, at a frozen crossroads village in Korea, one American regiment made a decision so unexpected, so defiant, that it shocked an entire Chinese army command. They didn't run. They didn't break out. They didn't surrender. They stayed. And what happened next permanently changed the course of the Korean War. This is the true story of Chipyong-ni, the battle where Chinese generals realized, too late, that the enemy they had chased for months had finally stopped running. Setting the stage, the Chinese advance. By early 1951, the Chinese People's Volunteer Army believed they had solved the American problem. Since crossing the Yalu River months earlier, their strategy had worked almost flawlessly. They moved at night. They avoided roads. They traveled light, fast, and silent. They didn't fight the Americans head-on. They surrounded them. At Unsan, at the Chongchan River, at the Chosin Reservoir. Again and again, American and UN units collapsed under the psychological weight of encirclement. Once cut off, morale crumbled. Command structures fractured. Withdrawals turned into disasters. Chinese commanders learned an important lesson. You didn't have to destroy American units. You only had to convince them they were surrounded. So when Chinese forces launched their massive four-phase offensive to retake Seoul, they expected more of the same. One village stood directly in their way. Chipyong-ni. Why Chipyong-ni mattered. Chipyong-ni wasn't just a village. It was a crossroads. If the Chinese captured it, the entire western flank of the UN 8th Army would collapse. Supply routes would be severed. Seoul would fall again. To the Chinese High Command, it looked like an easy prize. A single American regiment, deep behind enemy lines, surrounded by hills, outnumbered, isolated, exposed. By every rule of war, they should have been retreating. But when Chinese scouts crawled close to the village on the night of February 13th, what they saw made no sense. The first shock they were digging in, the scouts expected chaos. Trucks starting engines, officers shouting orders, men loading equipment for a desperate breakout. Instead, silence. Through binoculars, Chinese scouts watched American soldiers calmly digging foxholes, stringing barbed wire, laying mines, positioning artillery inside the perimeter, not behind it, inside it. The Americans weren't preparing to leave. They were preparing to fight. Chinese officers stared at their maps in disbelief. Why would a surrounded force stay in a bowl-shaped valley? Why pull artillery forward instead of retreating with it? Was this arrogance, ignorance, or something far more dangerous? The Americans' decision, the unit at Chipyong-ni, was the 23rd Infantry Regiment, reinforced by a French battalion. Their commander understood something crucial. Every retreat so far had taught the Chinese one thing, that Americans would always fall back. So this time, the Americans decided to stop teaching that lesson. They formed a 360-degree defensive perimeter. Every hill was covered. Every approach overlapped with machine gun fire. They turned Chipyong-ni into a fortress. And they waited. The Chinese attack begins. As night fell on February 13th, the Chinese launched their assault. Bugles screamed. Whistles cut through the frozen air. Thousands of soldiers charged downhill, confident in the darkness. But then the night betrayed them. American aircraft dropped magnesium flares, turning darkness into daylight. Suddenly, the Chinese were exposed, dark figures moving across white snow. Then the firing started. Not panic rifle fire. A wall of steel. Quad .50 caliber machine guns, nicknamed meat choppers, opened up. Entire assault waves disappeared in seconds. Trees were shredded. Snow exploded. Human momentum stopped dead. Chinese officers received reports that made no tactical sense. The Americans were firing as if they had unlimited ammunition, as if retreat wasn't even an option. The French counterattack. On one sector of the perimeter, Chinese troops slammed into the French battalion. They expected collapse. Instead, the French did something unthinkable. They charged. bayonets out, grenades flying. In the frozen fields, French and Chinese soldiers collided in brutal hand-to-hand combat. The psychological impact was enormous. The enemy wasn't afraid of close combat. They welcomed it. Artillery at point-blank range. Then came the most shocking tactic of the battle. As Chinese troops pressed closer, American artillery crews lowered their guns, not firing in arcs, firing directly. 105 millimeters and 155 millimeters howitzers blasted point-blank into charging infantry. Entire units vanished in fire and concussion. Chinese doctrine depended on closing distance to neutralize artillery. At Chipyong-ni, that rule no longer applied. The siege fails. By dawn, the Chinese attack stalled. Thousands were dead, but the Americans were still standing. Chinese commanders adjusted their plan. If they couldn't break the perimeter, they would crush it. They identified a weak seam. Company G, holding key high ground. That night, they concentrated everything. The breakthrough, Chinese engineers blew gaps in the wire. Wave after wave poured through. Company G was overrun. For the first time, Chinese troops looked down into the village. Victory seemed certain. But again, the Americans didn't run. They fell back, reformed, and called artillery onto their own positions. Captured ground turned into a killing zone. The Chinese breakthrough became a death trap. The final shock, relief arrives. As dawn approached on February 15th, Chinese commanders prepared their final push. Then they heard it, a low, grinding roar. Tanks, Task Force Crombez, 23 M46 Patton tanks with infantry riding on top, charged straight through Chinese roadblocks. They didn't stop. They didn't slow. Barricades were crushed. Ambushes overrun. From the air, American fighters returned, dropping napalm. The encirclement collapsed. The trapped force was no longer American. It was Chinese. Aftermath, when the smoke cleared. American and French casualties, 350. Chinese casualties, estimated 5,000. Chipyong-ni was not just a battle. It was a message. The Chinese advance stopped. The war shifted into stalemate. The myth of unstoppable human waves was shattered. The Americans hadn't survived by luck. They survived because they chose to stand. At Chipyong-ni, surrounded troops refused to accept defeat as inevitable. They proved that encirclement is psychological, and psychology can be broken. That frozen valley became the moment when the Korean War changed direction. An avalanche hit a wall, and the wall held. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the most important battles of the Korean War, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful war history videos. Don't forget to comment below. And tell US in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps keep these stories alive.